A quiet morning disrupted. The sun rose over Cedarwood, a small suburban neighborhood nestled between rolling hills and quiet streets. Robert Bob Ellis, a 91-year-old World War I veteran, began his day like any other. His small house, adorned with decades-old military memorabilia, echoed with the creak of floorboards as he shuffled to the kitchen. Bob poured himself a cup of coffee, savoring the morning stillness. Outside, the world felt tranquil. Birds chirped in the old oak tree in his front yard, and children's laughter occasionally filtered through the open windows. It was a stark contrast to the life Bob once lived, a life filled with chaos, gunfire, and survival in the Pacific Theater. Despite the years, Bob's sharp mind and disciplined demeanor had not faded. He found solace in routine, and his daily walk to the park was his favorite ritual. Bob grabbed his faded military cap, embroidered with the emblem of his unit, and his trusted cane. The cane, a gift from a fellow veteran, was more than just a walking aid. It was a reminder of his resilience. The park was a short walk from his house, a place where he often sat on his favorite bench, feeding birds and chatting with passersby. An unexpected intrusion. That morning, the park was unusually busy. Families gathered. Children played on swings, and joggers passed by with friendly nods. Bob settled on his bench, appreciating the lively scene. As he reached into his bag for breadcrumbs to feed the sparrows, the sound of roaring engines broke the harmony. 6 motorcycles tore into the park, their riders clad in leather jackets adorned with skulls and flames. The group parked near the playground, their loud laughter and crude jokes quickly scattering the families. The tranquility of the park evaporated, replaced by an air of unease. Bob's calm gaze followed the commotion. He didn't flinch or move. Decades of war had taught him to read people, and he saw these men for what they were, bullies searching for a target. Unfortunately for them, Bob wasn't one to be intimidated. The confrontation begins. One of the bikers, a burly man with a thick beard and tattoos crawling up his arms, spotted Bob sitting alone. He smirked, nudging his companions. "Look at this guy," the biker said, pointing. "Grandpa's out here like it's his park." The gang sauntered over, forming a loose semicircle around Bob. The leader, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned closer. "What's an old fossil like you doing here?" He sneered. "Shouldn't you be in a home or something?" Bob met the man's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm exactly where I need to be. The real question is, why are you here, disturbing everyone else's peace?" The leader's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You've got a smart mouth for an old-timer," he said. He kicked Bob's cane, sending it clattering to the ground. The gang laughed, pulling out phones to record the scene. An unlikely turn of events. What happened next stunned everyone. With a speed and precision that defied his age, Bob grabbed the leader's wrist as he reached out again. In one fluid motion, he twisted the man's arm and brought him to his knees. The leader howled in pain, his bravado replaced by shock. The bikers froze, their laughter replaced by stunned silence. Bob straightened, his grip firm on the man's arm. His voice carried the weight of decades. "You boys picked the wrong man to mess with," he said, his tone unwavering. Before the other bikers could react, the commotion drew attention from nearby onlookers. A woman across the street yelled, "Leave him alone." Phones captured the scene as a crowd began to form. The tension rises. The bikers regrouped, their initial shock giving way to anger. The scared leader struggled to his feet, glaring at Bob. "You're gonna regret that, old man," he spat. Bob didn't flinch. He retrieved his cane, his movements deliberate. "I've faced worse than you," he replied. "If you think you're tough, you'd better be ready to prove it." The leader gestured to his crew, but before they could act, the distant wail of police sirens pierced the air. The bikers hesitated, their bravado cracking. The crowd began to murmur, some shouting for the bikers to leave. The gang exchanged nervous glances, their confidence waning. The leader growled under his breath, "Let's go." They mounted their bikes and roared away, their exit as chaotic as their arrival. A resilient spirit. As the crowd dispersed, Bob sat back on his bench, adjusting his cap. A young boy approached, wide-eyed. "Mister, are you a superhero?" he asked. Bob chuckled softly, patting the boy's shoulder. "Not quite, son. Just an old soldier who doesn't like bullies." The park slowly returned to its usual calm, but the events of the morning left an impression on everyone. Bob's quiet strength and unwavering courage reminded them that true resilience knows no age. As he made his way home, Bob couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers weren't done. Trouble, he knew, had a way of lingering. Yet Bob also knew that he wasn't alone. The neighborhood, inspired by his bravery, had begun to rally behind him. Whatever came next, he would be ready. Shadows of the past. The days following the park incident were a blur of attention and whispers. Bob Ellis was no stranger to confrontation, but he wasn't particularly fond of the spotlight it brought. The neighborhood buzzed with talk of the old war hero who stood his ground against a gang of bikers. Videos of the encounter had gone viral, earning Bob both admiration and curiosity from people far beyond Cedarwood. Yet, in the quiet moments, Bob felt a weight settling on his chest. He had spent most of his life avoiding unnecessary conflict. War had taught him one thing above all: battles leave scars, and some never heal. Now, it seemed trouble had found him again. And this time, it wasn't on a distant battlefield. It was right at his doorstep. A reminder of courage. On a crisp morning, a week after the incident, Bob stepped out onto his porch, his cane tapping against the wooden boards. The faint sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance made him pause. It was the third time in as many days. Someone was watching, testing his resolve. Bob tightened his grip on the cane and muttered under his breath, "You're wasting your time, boys." He glanced at the horizon, where the sun rose steadily, painting the sky with streaks of gold and pink. Cedarwood was waking up, and Bob wasn't about to let the bikers cast a shadow over his community. He had a visitor that morning, Mary Caldwell, a retired combat medic and an old friend from his veterans group. She arrived with a bag of pastries and her no-nonsense attitude, her short-cropped gray hair bouncing as she walked up the driveway. "Morning, Bob," she said, setting the pastries on his porch table. "Heard about your heroics at the park. Can't say I'm surprised." Bob chuckled softly, sitting down on his rocking chair. "Heroics? Just an old man doing what he's always done, standing up to bullies." Mary poured them both coffee from a thermos she'd brought. "Well, your heroics have stirred the pot. You know they're not going to let this go, right?" Bob nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." The veterans packed. That afternoon, Mary suggested gathering their old group of veterans. They had formed a tight-knit bond over the years, meeting monthly to reminisce and offer each other support. This time, though, their meeting had a more serious purpose. By early evening, 5 of them sat in Bob's living room. Frank Carter, a burly man who had served in Korea, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the room. George, a soft-spoken Navy veteran, sipped his tea in silence. Eleanor, a former Air Force mechanic, sat near the window, her hands busy knitting, but her ears keenly attuned to the conversation. Bob stood, his weathered face a mask of determination. "They're testing me," he said, pacing slowly. "But they're not just after me. They're trying to scare this whole neighborhood." Frank grunted. "Typical cowards. They're used to pushing people around and getting away with it." Eleanor nodded, but they picked the wrong guy to mess with. Mary spoke up, her voice steady. "We're not going to let them intimidate you, Bob, or anyone else. If they come back, they'll find out just how tough this neighborhood really is." They spent hours devising a plan. It wasn't about escalating violence. It was about showing strength and solidarity. They would take turns watching Bob's house and patrolling the neighborhood. They would involve the community, encouraging people to stand together against the gang's attempts at intimidation. The first warning. That night, Bob sat on his porch as the others dispersed, the sound of their car engines fading into the distance. The quiet streets seemed almost peaceful, but Bob's instincts told him otherwise. He'd learned long ago that peace was often the calm before the storm. Just after midnight, a loud crash shattered the stillness. Bob was on his feet in an instant, his cane in hand. He looked out the window to see his mailbox smashed to pieces, its shattered remains scattered across his lawn. Spray-painted on the front of his house were 3 words, "We'll be back." Bob's jaw tightened, but he didn't panic. He called Mary, who arrived within minutes, flashlight in hand. Together, they examined the damage. The message was clear, but it wasn't enough to shake Bob's resolve. "They're testing the waters," Mary said, her tone grim. "Trying to see if you'll fold." Bob nodded. "They don't know me very well." Rallying the neighborhood. The next morning, Bob made no attempt to cover up the graffiti. He wanted the bikers to see that their tactics hadn't worked. But more than that, he wanted the neighborhood to understand the importance of standing together. Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by to express their support. A young mother brought her 2 children to thank Bob personally. "My kids were at the park that day," she said, her voice trembling. "You made them feel safe." A group of teenagers volunteered to help clean up the graffiti, but Bob declined. "Let it stay," he said. "It's a reminder that we don't back down." By evening, word had spread, and a crowd gathered in Bob's front yard. Some brought food, others offered to stand watch. For the first time in years, Bob felt a sense of community stronger than ever before. The bikers may have tried to intimidate him, but all they had done was unite the people of Cedarwood. Preparing for the worst. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Bob and his fellow veterans gathered once more. They reinforced their plan, assigning shifts and coordinating efforts. Frank took the first watch, his towering presence enough to deter most troublemakers. Mary kept an eye on the perimeter, while Eleanor stayed in contact with the local police. But Bob knew that this was only the beginning. The bikers weren't just testing his resolve, they were laying the groundwork for something bigger. And when they came back, he would be ready. He sat on his porch late into the night, the soft creak of his rocking chair mingling with the distant hum of crickets. In his hands, he held his cane, not as a symbol of age or frailty, but as a reminder of the strength he carried within. Whatever storm the bikers brought, Bob was prepared to weather it, not just for himself, but for the neighborhood he called home. And in the shadows, unseen by Bob, a figure watched from a parked motorcycle, its engine idling softly before fading into the night. The battle was far from over. The calm before the storm. The days after the mailbox incident passed in an eerie silence. The bikers who had been so bold before seemed to have vanished. But Bob Ellis wasn't fooled. He had seen too much in his lifetime to mistake quiet for safety. The gang was regrouping, planning, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Despite the tension, Bob refused to let fear take root in his life. Every morning, he went about his routine as if nothing had changed. He walked to the park, greeted his neighbors, and spent afternoons working in his small garden. But his vigilance never wavered. Every shadow, every distant noise was a potential threat. The neighborhood, galvanized by Bob's resolve, had rallied around him. A rotation of watchful eyes now ensured that someone was always keeping an eye on his house. Mary Caldwell had even set up a makeshift command center in her garage, where she and the other veterans coordinated their efforts. They weren't just protecting Bob, they were protecting Cedarwood itself. A visitor arrives. One rainy afternoon, as Bob sipped coffee on his porch, a sleek black car rolled down the street. Its tinted windows and polished exterior stood out in the modest neighborhood. The car slowed as it approached Bob's house, eventually coming to a stop at the curb. Bob set his coffee down, his sharp eyes narrowing. He reached for his cane and stood, his posture straight despite his age. The driver's door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. He was middle-aged, with slicked-back hair and a confident demeanor that immediately set Bob on edge. "Mr. Ellis," the man said, his voice smooth as he approached the porch. "May I have a word?" Bob nodded toward the sidewalk. "You can talk from there." The man smirked but complied, keeping his distance. "My name is Vincent. I represent certain interests connected to the individuals you encountered at the park. I've been sent to resolve this situation." Bob's grip on his cane tightened. "Resolve it? Is that what you call intimidation and vandalism?" Vincent raised his hands in a mock gesture of peace. "Let's not escalate things, Mr. Ellis. My clients don't want any more trouble. They simply want to ensure their dignity is restored." Bob's expression didn't waver. Dignity. They lost that the moment they started harassing innocent people. Vincent's smile faded, replaced by a steely gaze. "This is a friendly warning, Mr. Ellis. Walk away. Let this go. Otherwise, things could become complicated." Bob stepped forward, his eyes locking with Vincent's. "I've faced worse than you can imagine, son. If you think a few threats will scare me, you're sorely mistaken." Vincent held his ground but said nothing. After a tense moment, he turned and walked back to his car. "I'll let my clients know you're resolute," he said before driving off. Preparing for trouble. That evening, Bob called Mary and the other veterans to his house. As they gathered in the living room, he recounted the conversation with Vincent. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. "They're testing the waters," Mary said, her tone grim, "seeing if we'll back down." "We won't," Frank replied, his deep voice resonating through the room. "But we need to be ready for whatever they throw at us." Over the next few days, the veterans and the neighborhood worked together to fortify their defenses. Watch groups patrolled the streets, and neighbors coordinated schedules to ensure someone was always on alert. The veterans trained the volunteers, teaching them basic self-defense and situational awareness. It wasn't much, but it gave the community a sense of empowerment. Bob, meanwhile, focused on preparing himself mentally. He spent hours in his backyard, practicing with his cane. It wasn't just a walking aid, it was a weapon, an extension of his body honed by years of experience. He also revisited old memories, drawing strength from the lessons he'd learned during the war. Courage, he reminded himself, wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing firm despite the fear. A warning ignored. One night, as Bob sat on his porch, he heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just down the street. He stood, his cane in hand, and peered into the darkness. Several motorcycles were parked at the edge of the block, their riders silhouetted against the faint glow of streetlights. One of them, a tall figure with broad shoulders, dismounted and began walking toward Bob's house. It was Troy, the gang's leader. His smirk was visible even in the dim light. "Evening, old man," Troy called out, "enjoying the peace and quiet." Bob stepped forward, standing at the edge of his porch. "What do you want?" Troy shrugged, his tone casual but laced with menace. "Just wanted to let you know we haven't forgotten about you. We're just giving you time to think things over." "I've done my thinking," Bob replied evenly. "You and your boys don't scare me." Troy chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far. We'll be back, and next time, we won't play nice." Bob didn't respond. He simply watched as Troy turned and walked back to his bike. The gang lingered for a moment before revving their engines and disappearing into the night. The gathering storm. The next morning, Bob met with Mary and the other veterans. They had expected the bikers to return, but Troy's veiled threats confirmed what they had feared. The gang was planning something big. "We need to take this seriously," Mary said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about you, Bob. They're targeting the whole neighborhood." Bob nodded. "Then we'll make sure they know this neighborhood isn't an easy target." Over the next few days, the veterans worked tirelessly. setting up a network of communication and contingency plans. They coordinated with the local police, who promised to respond quickly if trouble arose. The neighborhood, meanwhile, remained on edge. But their trust in Bob and his team gave them a sense of hope. As the days turned into weeks, the tension grew. The bikers were out there, waiting, watching, and planning their next move. Bob knew it was only a matter of time before the storm hit. But he also knew that when it did, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Cedarwood was ready, and so was he. The trap is set. The days stretched into a week, and the quiet tension in Cedarwood was palpable. The bikers had retreated into the shadows, their movements sporadic and unpredictable. But Bob Ellis and his team of veterans weren't idle. They had seen too many storms to believe this calm was anything but a prelude to chaos. Bob, Mary, Frank, and the rest of the team doubled down on their preparations. They transformed Mary's garage into a tactical hub, complete with maps of the neighborhood, walkie-talkies, and a rotation schedule for patrols. The neighbors pitched in where they could, delivering meals, providing supplies, and even keeping lookout from their windows. But Bob wasn't just preparing for defense. He was preparing to send a message to Troy and his gang that Cedarwood wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community ready to stand its ground. An unexpected ally. Late one evening, as the team gathered to review their plans, a knock echoed through Mary's garage. The veterans exchanged wary glances, their instincts kicking in. Mary opened the door cautiously, revealing a lanky teenager clutching a beat-up skateboard. "Can I help you?" Mary asked, her voice firm but kind. The boy hesitated before stepping forward. "My name's Tyler," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know those guys. The bikers. I think I can help." The room fell silent. Bob studied the boy, his sharp gaze dissecting every detail, his nervous stance, the slight tremble in his hands. "Why would you help us?" Bob finally asked. Tyler swallowed hard. "Because they're not just harassing you. They'd been messing with everyone. My mom owns the diner on the edge of town. They'd been shaking her down for money, threatening her. I can't stand it anymore." Mary stepped aside, motioning Tyler to enter. "What do you know?" "They're planning something," Tyler said, setting his skateboard against the wall. "I overheard them talking. They're bringing more guys. They want to make an example out of you, Mr. Ellis." Bob nodded, his expression unreadable. "When?" "Tomorrow night," Tyler said. "They're meeting at the old warehouse by the river first. They're planning to roll into the neighborhood after dark." Frank crossed his arms, his imposing figure casting a long shadow on the garage wall. "Why should we trust you?" Tyler looked up, his eyes pleading. "Because I hate what they're doing. And because I want them gone as much as you do." Bob placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, his voice steady. "Then you're in the right place, son." The veterans' plan. With Tyler's intel, the veterans adjusted their strategy. The warehouse provided an opportunity to catch the bikers off guard, but it also posed a risk. Confronting them on their turf could escalate the situation. The team debated the best course of action late into the night. "We could ambush them," Frank suggested, his tone serious. "Cut them off before they even get here." Mary shook her head. "That's exactly what they'd expect. We need to stay defensive, protect the neighborhood." Bob listened quietly, his mind working through the possibilities. Finally, he spoke. "We'll split up. Some of us will stay here, guarding the neighborhood. The rest will go to the warehouse, not to fight, but to show them we're watching." The group nodded in agreement. It was a calculated risk, but it was the best way to protect Cedarwood while sending a clear message to the gang. The calm before the fight. The following day was deceptively peaceful. Bob spent the morning walking through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors and checking on patrols. Many stopped to thank him, their gratitude evident in their words and gestures. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the veterans gathered one last time to review their plan. Bob addressed the group, his voice carrying the weight of years of leadership. "This isn't just about us," he said. It's about standing up to bullies, showing them they can't take what doesn't belong to them. Whatever happens tonight, we stand together. The team split into two groups. Bob, Mary, and Frank would go to the warehouse, while Eleanor and the others stayed behind to defend the neighborhood. Tyler volunteered to guide the team to the warehouse, his determination outweighing his fear. The warehouse encounter. As the veterans approached the abandoned warehouse, the sound of roaring engines filled the night air. Dozens of motorcycles were parked outside, their riders gathered in a loose circle. The bikers laughed and shouted, their voices echoing off the rusted metal walls. Bob motioned for his team to stay back, observing the scene from the shadows. Troy stood in the center of the group, his cocky demeanor on full display as he barked orders to his gang. "We hit the old man's place first," Troy said, his voice carrying over the noise. "Then we move through the rest of the neighborhood. Show these people who's in charge." Bob stepped forward, his cane tapping against the concrete. The sound cut through the din, drawing every eye to him. The veterans emerged from the shadows, their presence quiet but commanding. Troy's smirk faltered. Well, look who decided to join us." "You boys are making a mistake," Bob said, his tone steady. "You've got one chance to turn around and leave this town for good." Troy laughed, but it was forced. "And what if we don't?" Bob leaned on his cane, his gaze unflinching. "Then you'll find out what happens when you underestimate people who fought for their country and for their home." The bikers hesitated, their bravado cracking under the weight of the veterans' quiet confidence. For a moment, the night hung in a fragile balance, the tension thick enough to cut. Then, in the distance, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the air. The bikers exchanged nervous glances as the realization set in. Someone had called the cops. Troy glared at Bob. "You think this is over? It's not." "We'll be ready," Bob replied. As the sirens grew louder, the bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared away into the night. Bob watched them go, his expression unreadable. Mary stepped beside him. "Do you think they'll be back?" Bob nodded. "They will, but so will we." A community united. The veterans returned to Cedarwood to find the neighborhood safe and intact. Eleanor and the others had held their ground, their presence enough to deter any attempt at retaliation. As dawn broke, the neighborhood gathered in Bob's front yard, their faces filled with a mix of relief and determination. Bob addressed them, his voice carrying the strength of someone who had seen the worst and endured. "This isn't over, but tonight we showed them what we're made of. And when they come back, we'll show them again." The crowd erupted into applause, their unity unshaken. The battle wasn't over, but Cedarwood was ready for whatever came next. A reckoning in the shadows. The day after the warehouse confrontation was deceptively calm. Cedarwood basked in an uneasy quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The bikers' retreat had been a small victory, but Bob Ellis and his team of veterans knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The gang's leader, Troy, had made it clear they weren't done, and Bob understood the nature of bullies. They always came back, angrier and more dangerous. A warning from the past. As the morning sunlight streamed into Bob's living room, he sat by the window with a cup of coffee, his cane resting across his lap. He watched as neighbors passed by, some waving or offering nods of gratitude. It was a scene of normalcy, but Bob felt the weight of an impending storm. His instincts, sharpened by decades of survival, told him the bikers were regrouping. A knock at the door broke his reverie. It was Tyler, the lanky teenager who had provided the critical intel about the gang's plans. Tyler looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes and his skateboard tucked awkwardly under one arm. "They're planning something big," Tyler said, not waiting for an invitation to enter. "I overheard them talking again. Troy's bringing in reinforcements, guys from other chapters. They're calling it payback night." Bob set his coffee down and leaned forward. "When?" "Tonight," Tyler replied. "They're planning to hit your house first, then anyone else who gets in their way. They want to make an example out of you." Bob's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Good. Let them come." Tyler blinked, confused. "Good? How is that good?" "Because this time," Bob said, standing with the aid of his cane, "we'll be ready." Rallying the forces. That afternoon, Bob called an emergency meeting with the veterans and key neighborhood allies. They gathered in Mary's garage, the air thick with determination. Frank, Mary, Eleanor, and the others sat in a semicircle, their faces etched with resolve. "Troy's coming back," Bob began, his voice calm but firm. "And he's not coming alone. This is our chance to put an end to this, once and for all." Mary crossed her arms. "What's the plan?" Bob gestured to the map of cedarwood pinned to the wall. "We can't wait for them to bring the fight to us. We need to control the battlefield. We'll fortify this neighborhood, make sure every exit is watched, and set up a few surprises for them along the way." Frank cracked his knuckles. "Sounds like my kind of fight." Eleanor nodded. "What about the neighbors? We can't put them in harm's way." "They'll be safe," Bob assured her. "We've already coordinated with those who want to help, and anyone who doesn't feel comfortable can stay inside. But this isn't just about us. This is about showing these bullies that they can't push people around." The group spent the next several hours preparing. They reinforced key entry points, set up a system of signals using flashlights and radios, and coordinated shifts for patrols. Bob worked tirelessly, his energy belying his age. He wasn't just defending his home. He was defending the principles he had fought for his entire life. The calm before the fight. As night fell, Cedarwood took on an almost surreal stillness. The streets were empty, the houses darkened. But behind closed doors, the neighborhood was alive with quiet anticipation. Groups of volunteers stood ready at key locations, their faces illuminated by the glow of cell phones and flashlights. Bob stood on his porch, his cane in hand, and his military cap firmly on his head. Mary joined him, her sharp eyes scanning the street. "Do you think they'll show?" she asked. "They'll show," Bob replied. "Men like Troy don't back down. They double down." The faint hum of engines in the distance confirmed his words. Bob and Mary exchanged a glance before she clicked her radio. "They're coming," she said. "Everyone, stay sharp." The first wave. The bikers arrived in force. A convoy of motorcycles and pickup trucks rumbled into the neighborhood, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Troy led the charge, his smirk illuminated by the glow of his bike's headlight. Behind him were nearly 24 riders, their numbers bolstered by reinforcements from nearby towns. As they approached Bob's house, the gang slowed to a stop. Troy dismounted, his boots crunching against the pavement as he strode forward. He called out, his voice echoing through the silent street. "Come on out, old man. Let's settle this once and for all." Bob stepped off his porch, his silhouette stark against the light from the house. He didn't flinch or hesitate, his cane tapping against the pavement as he walked toward Troy. "You've had your fun," Bob said, his voice carrying across the distance. "But it ends here." Troy laughed, his gang joining in. "You really think you can stop us? Look around, old man. You're outnumbered." Bob tilted his head slightly, a faint smile on his lips. "Am I?" From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Mary, Frank, Eleanor, and the other veterans stepped into the light, their presence quiet but commanding. Behind them, neighbors armed with flashlights, radios, and makeshift barricades appeared, their numbers swelling with every passing moment. Troy's smirk faltered. "What is this?" "It's a community," Bob replied, his voice like steel. "And we don't bow to bullies." The standoff. For a moment, the night hung in perfect stillness. The bikers who had expected easy prey now found themselves facing a united front. Their bravado cracked, uncertainty creeping into their ranks. But Troy wasn't ready to give up. He stepped closer to Bob, his voice low and menacing. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you. Bob met Troy's glare without flinching. Maybe not, but they'll sure as hell give you something to think about. The tension reached its breaking point as one of the bikers, emboldened by the silence, lunged forward. He never reached his target. With a quick flick of his cane, Bob tripped the man, sending him sprawling to the ground. Mary stepped forward, her stance firm, and the rest of the veterans followed suit. Troy's face darkened. "You're making a big mistake." "No," Bob said, his voice steady. "The mistake was thinking we'd let you win." The bikers hesitated, their numbers no longer the advantage they had assumed. Behind them, the distant sound of police sirens began to wail, growing louder with every second. Troy cursed under his breath, motioning for his gang to retreat. "This isn't over," he growled. "It is if you're smart," Bob replied. A victory in unity. As the bikers fled into the night, the neighborhood erupted in quiet cheers and relieved sighs. The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights illuminating the street. Bob and his team explained what had happened, their calm demeanor earning the officers' respect. As dawn broke over Cedarwood, the community gathered in Bob's yard. Neighbors thanked him, volunteers shared stories of the night's events, and the veterans stood together, their bond stronger than ever. Mary turned to Bob, a rare smile on her face. "Think they'll come back?" Bob adjusted his cap, his gaze steady. "If they do, they'll find us waiting." The battle wasn't just a victory for Bob and the veterans. It was a victory for Cedarwood. A reminder that even in the face of intimidation, unity and courage could overcome anything. The legacy of courage. The morning after the confrontation, Cedarwood woke to a renewed sense of unity. The bikers had been driven out, their threats silenced by the collective resolve of the community. Yet, as Bob Ellis sat on his porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, he felt a lingering unease. Troy's parting words, "This isn't over," echoed in his mind. Men like Troy rarely gave up so easily. A community united. As the day unfolded, neighbors came by to express their gratitude. They brought homemade pies, fresh coffee, and heartfelt thanks. Children who had once been too afraid to play outside ran freely now, their laughter filling the air. Bob watched it all with a quiet pride, but his focus never wavered. He knew the bikers might still return, and he wanted Cedarwood to be ready. Mary Caldwell arrived mid-morning, her sharp eyes scanning the street as she approached. "You did it, Bob," she said, sitting beside him. "You brought this neighborhood together." Bob shook his head. "We all did. This wasn't just me." "Don't be modest," Mary replied. "If it weren't for you, half of these people wouldn't have known they had it in them to stand up." Frank joined them soon after, carrying a bag of tools. "Thought I'd help fix that mailbox," he said, gesturing to the remains of the one the bikers had smashed. Bob nodded in appreciation. As the three veterans worked together, more neighbors came to help. What started as a small repair project turned into a community effort. People painted fences, cleaned graffiti, and repaired minor damages around the neighborhood. The streets that had once been tense with fear now buzzed with the energy of resilience. A shadow looms. By afternoon, the festive atmosphere was dampened by the arrival of a sleek black car. Bob recognized it immediately. Vincent, the man who had visited him before, stepped out, his suit immaculate and his expression unreadable. "Mr. Ellis," Vincent said, his tone polite but firm. "May I have a word?" Bob stepped forward, his cane in hand. "Make it quick." Vincent's gaze swept over the gathering neighbors before settling on Bob. "You've made quite an impression. The neighborhood looks lively." Bob's jaw tightened. "If you've got something to say, say it." Vincent sighed, as if disappointed. "My associates wanted me to convey their displeasure with recent events. They don't take kindly to humiliation." Bob's eyes narrowed. "Your associates are cowards who thought they could scare people into submission. They failed." Vincent chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. "Perhaps, but failure has consequences, Mr. Ellis. for everyone involved. Bob took a step closer, his voice low but firm. "Let me make something clear. Cedarwood doesn't bow to threats. You can tell your associates to stay away. If they don't, they'll regret it." Vincent held Bob's gaze for a long moment before nodding. "You're braver than most, but bravery has its limits." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, driving off into the distance. The final stand. That evening, Bob gathered the veterans once more. They met in Mary's garage, the air heavy with anticipation. "They'll come back," Bob said, his tone resolute. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they will. We need to be ready." The group nodded in agreement. Mary spoke up. "This isn't just about us anymore. The whole neighborhood is counting on us." Frank leaned against the wall, his expression serious. "Then we don't just defend. We send a message." The veterans spent the night reinforcing their plans. They coordinated with the local police, who promised increased patrols. They distributed walkie-talkies to key members of the community and set up a network of signals. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a fortress of unity. The unexpected battle. Around midnight, the familiar roar of motorcycle engines shattered the silence. This time, it wasn't just a few bikers. It was an entire convoy. Headlights illuminated the street as Troy and his gang returned, their numbers larger than before. Bob stood on his porch, his cane in hand and his cap pulled low. Mary and Frank flanked him, their presence a silent testament to the strength of their bond. The bikers dismounted, their expressions filled with malice. Troy stepped forward, his smirk as smug as ever. "You should have taken the warning, old man." Bob didn't flinch, "And you should have stayed away." Troy motioned to his gang, and they began to spread out, their movements predatory. But before they could get far, lights flickered on in nearly every house. Doors opened, and neighbors stepped out, armed with flashlights, radios, and an unshakable resolve. Behind them, the veterans emerged, their presence commanding. Frank held a thick wooden staff, Mary carried a whistle to signal the crowd, and Eleanor stood tall with a look that could pierce steel. The bikers hesitated, their confidence faltering in the face of such overwhelming unity. "This is your last chance," Bob said, his voice like steel. "Leave, and don't come back." Troy sneered. "Or what?" Before Bob could respond, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The bikers exchanged nervous glances as squad cars appeared, blocking their escape routes. Officers stepped out, weapons drawn, their presence a final warning. Troy's bravado cracked. He gestured to his gang, and they reluctantly began retreating. "This isn't over," he growled. "It is if you're smart," Bob replied, watching as the bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared away. A legacy secured. As the police took statements and the neighborhood began to settle, Bob stood on his porch, watching the dawn break over Cedarwood. Mary joined him, a rare smile on her face. "You did it, Bob," she said. "They're gone." Bob shook his head. "We did it. All of us." The neighborhood had proven something powerful that night, that even in the face of intimidation, a united community was unstoppable. Cedarwood wasn't just a place to live. It was a testament to the strength of collective courage. As Bob sat down, his cane resting by his side, a young boy ran up to the porch. "Mister, you're a real hero," the boy exclaimed. Bob smiled, tipping his cap. "Not a hero, son, just someone who doesn't like bullies." And with that, Bob leaned back, letting the morning sun warm his face, knowing that Cedarwood's legacy of courage would endure. The final morning. As the morning sun rose higher, Cedarwood began to stir back to life. The events of the previous night were already becoming neighborhood lore, and the sense of camaraderie was palpable. Neighbors who had never spoken before exchanged greetings, shared stories, and offered one another help with minor repairs. Bob Ellis sat on his porch, his cane resting across his lap, as Mary and Frank joined him. The two veterans carried steaming mugs of coffee, their expressions a mix of relief and pride. "You think they're really gone for good?" Mary asked, sitting beside Bob. Bob took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Men like Troy don't give up easily, but they've been humiliated, twice now. They know this community isn't afraid of them. That counts for something." Frank leaned back against the porch railing, his muscular arms crossed. "If they do come back, they'll think twice before trying anything stupid." Bob nodded. "And if they do, they'll find us ready, just like always." A surprise visit. As the trio sat in companionable silence, a sleek black car appeared at the end of the street, its approach slow and deliberate. Bob stiffened, his sharp eyes narrowing as he recognized the vehicle. Mary and Frank exchanged wary glances but remained seated. The car stopped in front of Bob's house, and Vincent stepped out, his tailored suit immaculate despite the tension of the previous night. He walked toward the porch with measured steps, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Ellis," Vincent said, stopping at the foot of the steps. "May I speak with you?" Bob didn't respond immediately. He studied the man, looking for any signs of deception or malice. Finally, he gestured for Vincent to speak. "I'm here to deliver a message from my associates," Vincent began. "They've decided to cut their losses. You've made your point, and they've realized this neighborhood isn't worth the trouble." Bob raised an eyebrow. "And you expect me to believe they'll just walk away?" Vincent smirked faintly. "They don't like to admit defeat, but even they know when to retreat. Consider this an unofficial truce." Mary spoke up, her tone sharp. "Truce or not, if they so much as step foot in Cedarwood again, they'll regret it." Vincent inclined his head. "Understood. I'll make sure they get the message." He turned to leave but paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Ellis, I respect what you've done here. Not many people have the guts to stand up to men like Troy." Bob's voice was calm but firm. "It's not about guts. It's about doing what's right." Vincent nodded, got back into his car, and drove away, leaving the street quiet once more. The neighborhood's hero. By midday, the story of Cedarwood's stand had spread far beyond the neighborhood. News crews arrived, eager to interview Bob and the veterans. Despite his aversion to the spotlight, Bob agreed to speak on behalf of the community. Standing in front of his repaired mailbox, he addressed the reporters with the same quiet strength that had inspired Cedarwood to unite. "This isn't about me," Bob said, his voice steady. "This is about what happens when people stand together. Bullies thrive on fear, but when we refuse to give in, they lose their power. That's what happened here, and it's a lesson I hope others can take to heart." As the reporters scribbled notes and cameras flashed, a small group of children approached Bob, their eyes wide with admiration. One of them, a young girl with pigtails, handed him a drawing she had made. It showed Bob standing tall with his cane, surrounded by smiling neighbors. At the top, she had written, "Our hero." Bob smiled, his heart warmed by the gesture. "Thank you," he said softly, ruffling the girl's hair. "This means a lot." A quiet evening. As the day turned to evening, the neighborhood finally began to relax. Families gathered on porches, children played in the streets, and the faint hum of conversation filled the air. Cedarwood felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Bob sat on his porch, watching the scene with a sense of fulfillment. Mary and Frank joined him once more, each holding a cold beer. "We did good, Bob," Frank said, raising his bottle. "Really good." Bob nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did. And it wasn't just us. The whole neighborhood came together. That's something special." Mary leaned back in her chair, a rare smile on her face. "You've earned some rest, old man, but something tells me you're not ready to slow down." Bob chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Maybe not. There's always work to be done." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a golden glow, Bob closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the peace. For the first time in weeks, Cedarwood felt safe, and as long as Bob Ellis was there, it always would be.